I woke up that morning staring at my reflection and barely recognized the person in the mirror. There was a strange softness in my face, a curve in my jawline I hadn't noticed before, and my eyes looked different, almost pleading. I didn't know if I was terrified or exhilarated, but something deep inside whispered that today I would stop hiding, even if only for a week. I had always wondered what it felt like to step fully into a life not dictated by the usual rules, to feel the world through someone else's skin, and somehow, without fully understanding why, I had promised myself I'd become a woman for 7 days, just to see. The first step was choosing her. Not a costume, not a disguise. She, the version of me I had kept locked in a box of secret daydreams. I traced her outline in the mirror with trembling fingers, imagining the flow of hair, the subtle arch of eyebrows, the careful curve of lips. My heart raced as I pulled the wig over my head, its synthetic strands brushing against my cheeks like a stranger's hand. Then the makeup, each stroke a revelation, each brush a tiny surrender to a version of myself I had only dared to imagine in the dark. By the time I stepped back, I was half afraid to touch my face, half afraid someone might see the stranger I had become and recognize me anyway. I dressed slowly, letting the fabric slide across my body like water, learning its language. The skirt swirled around my legs, soft and alien, yet comforting in a way I hadn't expected. Shoes clicked against the floor, unfamiliar rhythms echoing in my chest. I caught my reflection again and gasped. My hands trembled. The reflection was me, and not me at the same time. For a moment, I wasn't sure if the world outside would see me as I saw myself, or if it would simply laugh at the attempt. But somewhere beneath the fear, excitement bubbled, raw, urgent, impossible to ignore. When I stepped outside, the air hit differently. Every glance felt amplified. I could feel my pulse in my throat as I walked down the street. I noticed the smallest things, the tilt of a passerby's head, the way the wind lifted my hair, the subtle sway of my hips I had never allowed myself to feel before. It was terrifying and intoxicating. I wanted to run and hide, but I also wanted to linger in the sensation, to let it consume me. I was both performer and audience, watcher and spectacle, unsure whether I was daring the world or myself. The first encounter came faster than I anticipated. A neighbor waved, smiling politely, and my chest constricted with panic and anticipation. Should I nod, smile, speak? Each movement felt like a performance in a language I had never spoken. I chose a small, tentative wave, and the relief that nothing exploded, that nothing cracked irreparably, was almost dizzying. Could it be this simple? Could the world, at least some parts of it, accept this version of me without judgment? My mind swirled with questions as I walked, each one a tug-of-war between fear and exhilaration. By the time I returned home, my emotions were tangled in ways I couldn't untangle. There was pride, embarrassment, curiosity, fear, longing, all layered in a way I had never experienced before. Sitting alone in my room, looking at her reflection one more time, I realized that this was just the beginning. This week was going to challenge every assumption I had about myself, about identity, about how the world saw me. And deep down, part of me thrilled at the uncertainty, at the possibility that I might discover something I hadn't known I was missing. The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of purpose. The sun filtered through my blinds, painting stripes across my bedroom floor, and for a moment I just lay there, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside, imagining the life I was about to inhabit. As I brushed my fingers along my jawline, I realized I could already feel subtle differences, not physical, at least not all of them, but in the way I held myself, the way my own reflection met my gaze. There was a tension there, a fragile balance between who I had been and who I was daring to become. I felt both exhilarated and exposed, like walking naked through the corridors of my own mind. Dressing that morning was a ritual I hadn't anticipated. Each article of clothing carried weight, meaning, and an unfamiliar intimacy. I chose a soft blouse, pale blue that brought out something in my eyes, and a skirt that hugged my waist in ways I had never noticed my body could be hugged. As I smoothed the fabric down, I noticed the tiniest changes, the way the skirt swayed when I shifted, how the light caught the makeup across my cheekbones, how the wig, slightly curling at the ends, seemed almost alive. It felt like I was layering myself with secrets and truths simultaneously, draping my identity over my own reflection to see what stuck. I ventured out into the streets with a mixture of apprehension and thrill. Each step felt heavier than the last, but not in a physical sense. The weight was in the awareness of every gaze, every possibility. I passed strangers who didn't notice, or pretended not to notice, and it was liberating. But then came a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. A group of young women laughed softly as I walked past, their glances like tiny needles against my skin. My chest tightened, a mixture of embarrassment, longing, and something else I couldn't name. I wanted to retreat, to vanish into anonymity, yet another part of me thrilled at the fact that I existed in this space, visible, undeniable, and undeniably different. Lunch was an exercise in quiet anxiety. Sitting alone in a cafe, the waitress approached with a smile that felt both neutral and probing. Ordering my food, I found myself stumbling over words I normally spoke with ease, my voice higher than I expected, softer, unfamiliar even to me. Each syllable sounded like a test, each pause a question of legitimacy. And yet, when I caught my reflection in the window across the room, I felt a pang of wonder. This version of me was real. She existed in a way I had never allowed before, and for the first time, I wasn't pretending even to myself. By mid-afternoon, I found myself wandering into a small boutique I had never noticed. The store was quiet, almost intimate, and as I browsed the racks of clothing, a strange calm settled over me. I picked up a scarf, silk and light, letting it slip through my fingers. It was absurd, really, to feel such emotional resonance over a piece of fabric, but it wasn't just fabric. It was affirmation, a tiny symbol that this life, this version of me, could be tangible, solid, and beautiful. I tried it on in the mirror, wrapping it around my neck, and for a moment, the reflection staring back wasn't the reflection of a man in costume. It was her, fully alive, daring, delicate, and defiant all at once. Evening brought its own challenges. Walking home, the streets were busier, the eyes more numerous. A man on the subway looked at me in a way that made my stomach churn. Curiosity, judgment, something that I couldn't quite name. My first instinct was to shrink, to blend, to make myself small and invisible. But I caught myself in the mirrored panel by the door and forced my shoulders back, straightening my posture, letting my head lift. It was almost painful to act brave, yet intoxicating. Each step felt like a declaration. I existed here, I belonged, even if the world hadn't agreed yet. Back in my apartment, I collapsed onto the bed, utterly exhausted. My mind raced with every interaction, every glance, every fleeting smile or smirk I had endured. There were tears, unbidden, dripping quietly onto the pillow, not of sadness, exactly, but of release, of recognition, of a life I had never allowed myself to live, finally brushing against my fingertips. The weeks stretched before me like an unknown horizon, full of promise, fear, and revelation. I had only just begun to learn who she was, and already I knew that I could not unsee her, could not unfeel her. The third day began with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. By now, the routines that had felt foreign on the first morning, the wig, the makeup, the careful selection of clothing, had begun to feel like second skin, but my reflection still startled me every time I met her gaze. She was becoming more real, more insistent, and sometimes I felt as though she might slip away if I blinked too long or turned my back. I sat on the edge of the bed for what felt like an eternity, tracing my fingers along the curve of my jaw, along the delicate slope of my collarbone, and wondered how something so terrifying could also feel so natural. That morning I decided to go further, to test the boundaries of this experiment. I chose a dress that clung to my waist and flared just above my knees, a soft lavender that made my skin seem to glow in the morning light. It was daring in a way that made my stomach knot, but also thrilling. As I slipped into heels, my legs wobbling at first, I realized that the act of moving in this new body, this new persona, was more than physical. It was psychological, emotional, spiritual. Each step carried weight, balance, vulnerability, and defiance all at once. I left the apartment determined to explore the city in a way I had never dared before. Walking down familiar streets, I felt them differently. Each corner, each storefront, each passerby a brushstroke in a painting that I was only just beginning to see. People's reactions varied, subtle but unmistakable. A man held the door for me with a polite nod. A young woman smiled knowingly as our eyes met in the cafe window. Yet there were also stares, fleeting but heavy, that made my stomach tighten and my heart race. I felt exposed, raw, yet oddly powerful. There was something exhilarating about being both visible and unknown, seen yet unclaimed. By mid-morning, I found myself drawn to the park, to a quiet bench beneath the bare branches of a wintering tree. I watched families stroll, dogs chase each other, couples laugh, and for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine living in this skin beyond a week, beyond experimentation. But then doubt crept in, sharp and insistent. Could I really exist here fully, without retreating into shadows or excuses? Could the world accept me, or, more importantly, could I accept myself? The questions were relentless, but they were alive, and in that aliveness, I felt a strange comfort. Lunch was almost unbearable. Sitting at a small table, I noticed every detail, the slight tilt of my head, the way my fingers wrapped around the cup, the way my legs crossed with a grace I hadn't known I possessed. Every subtle movement felt magnified, like I was performing for an invisible audience. And yet, in that scrutiny, I found liberation. I realized that I had spent years censoring myself, shrinking to fit the expectations of others, and now I was learning, inch by inch, to inhabit a space that belonged to me and me alone. The most unexpected challenge of the day came in the form of an acquaintance I hadn't expected to see. We passed each other on the street, and the recognition in their eyes hit me like a wave. Their smile faltered, the hesitation in their step almost physical, and I felt my cheeks burn. I wanted to turn away, to hide, but instead, I lifted my chin, allowed myself a small, steady smile, and met their gaze. The encounter lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to shake me to my core. How could I reconcile this duality? The version of me the world thought it knew, and the one I was becoming. The answer eluded me, leaving only a buzzing tension that refused to settle. By afternoon, I sought refuge in a small bookstore tucked away on a side street. The quiet aisles and the scent of paper offered solace. I ran my fingers along the spines, feeling the textures, inhaling the faint perfume of ink and dust. Alone among books, I allowed myself to dream out loud, to imagine conversations, lives, possibilities. I imagined her voice, the one I had been discovering in mirrors and reflections, speaking freely, without fear or judgment. And yet, even in this haven, I felt the pull of the outside world, of the judgment, of the constant calculations that came with visibility. It was exhausting and intoxicating, frightening and liberating, all at once. Evening descended with a strange, heavy quiet. The streets glimmered under lamplight, reflections in puddles dancing like memories of the day. Walking home, I realized that my perception of myself had shifted subtly, irreversibly. I felt more awake, more attuned, more alive in a way that scared me as much as it thrilled me. The reflection in store windows no longer startled me. It seemed almost familiar, though each glance still held a thrill of discovery. I was beginning to see her, not just as an experiment, but as a presence, a part of me that had always existed in shadow, waiting to be acknowledged. When I returned to my apartment, I sank onto the bed, utterly drained yet unwilling to sleep. I replayed the day in my mind, the stares, the smiles, the hesitant recognition, the self-discovery, and felt a strange tenderness toward myself. this week I realized wasn't just about pretending or experimenting. It was about listening to a part of me I had ignored, feared, or dismissed. It was about courage, vulnerability, and a strange, exhilarating honesty. And as I lay there, tracing the outline of my own reflection in my mind, I felt the first flickers of acceptance, small but real, like a candle in a dark room, fragile yet persistent. Day 4 began with an almost unbearable tension, a mix of anticipation and a gnawing fear that had settled in my chest overnight. I woke before my alarm, staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange, intimate ache in my chest, not pain exactly, but a longing I couldn't name. I ran my fingers through my hair, brushing aside strands of wig that had slipped during the night, and for a fleeting second, I forgot which version of myself I had been yesterday and which I was today. This was no longer just a costume, no longer just an experiment. She had begun to bleed into me, threading her presence into my bones and muscles, making my own reflection feel like someone I needed to meet, not just watch. Dressing took longer that morning. I chose a fitted dress, deep burgundy, that wrapped around my waist and flared just above my knees. Each motion was deliberate, almost ceremonial. I adjusted the wig, applied makeup with slow precision, and for the first time, I noticed how my movements themselves had changed. There was a subtle fluidity in my gestures, a softness that hadn't existed before, a sway to my hips that felt both foreign and undeniably mine. My reflection stared back at me, confident, curious, alive, and I realized I was beginning to inhabit her rather than inhabit myself pretending. The realization made my heart hammer in my chest and my palms damp with nervous excitement. I decided to go out early before the city streets filled with the usual crowd. The quiet morning air felt like a protective blanket, giving me space to test the boundaries of this new identity. I walked through parks, along side streets, through neighborhoods that had always seemed mundane. And yet, through her eyes, through her body, everything seemed sharper, more vibrant, more fraught with meaning. A breeze lifted the hem of my skirt, and I felt an unfamiliar thrill, a tiny, electric rush that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with self-recognition. I felt alive in ways I hadn't even known I could be. Then, unexpectedly, the social test came. A group of colleagues I hadn't expected to see were walking toward me on the sidewalk. My stomach knotted, my breath caught in my throat. This was no longer a stranger noticing a fleeting presence. This was the gaze of people who knew me intimately, people who had constructed narratives of who I was. I felt the weight of their assumptions pressing against me, and for a moment, I wanted to turn and flee. But something inside me, the new, unnameable part of me, urged me to stand firm. I smiled, tentative, measured, and stepped toward them. The way their eyes widened, flickering between recognition, confusion, and surprise, nearly made my knees buckle. Their voices were polite, hesitant. They laughed softly at some small joke I wasn't entirely sure I understood. I stumbled through words, my voice higher, lighter, and heard in it a strange, foreign melody, like hearing a song I had loved in childhood but had never known the words to. By the time we parted ways, I was shaking, not with embarrassment, not with shame, but with the raw, unfiltered power of having existed fully in that moment. The afternoon brought solitude and reflection. I wandered into a quiet cafe, a place I had never noticed before, where the sunlight pooled across the wooden floor in golden squares. I ordered tea, sat near a window, and watched the city move. And as I watched, I felt a strange, aching longing, a desire not to blend, not to hide, not to be normal, but simply to exist fully. My reflection in the glass across from me caught my eye, and I realized with a shiver that she was more than a reflection. She was an assertion, a truth that had been waiting quietly in the shadows of my life, and now, almost painfully, she demanded recognition. That evening, the tension escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Walking home through the crowded streets, I noticed how every glance, every reaction, seemed magnified. Some were approving, some curious, some indifferent, and some tinged with the faintest hint of judgment. I felt myself bracing, flinching, adjusting my posture, my expression, my voice with each passing moment. And yet, amidst the anxiety, there was a thrill, a sense that I was navigating uncharted territory, a world that was both terrifying and intoxicating. I realized I was discovering layers of myself I had buried or ignored, emotions I had never let surface, and a version of courage I hadn't known I possessed. Back in my apartment, I collapsed onto the bed, utterly spent. I traced the contours of my reflection in the mirror, studied the lines of her face, the curve of her lips, the softness of her cheeks. For the first time, I didn't want to remove the wig or wash away the makeup. I wanted to linger in her presence, to explore her fully, to understand her deeply. But alongside the fascination was a gnawing uncertainty. How long could I inhabit this identity without being torn apart by the world outside? How much of myself was being transformed, and how much was being lost? The questions were endless, the tension palpable. Yet there was no turning back. As I lay there, listening to the city hum through my windows, I realized that this week, which had begun as an experiment, was fast becoming a revelation. She was not just a mask, not just a temporary guise. She was a mirror, a lens, a path into a part of myself I had never allowed to breathe. And for the first time, I felt a fragile, exhilarating acceptance creeping in, like sunlight through cracks in a dark room. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, what social encounters or self-discoveries awaited, but I felt certain of one thing. I could not unsee her, I could not unknow her, and I could not ignore the truth that had been waiting quietly inside me all along. Day 5 hit me like a wave I wasn't prepared for. I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the window, gray light filling the room in soft, melancholy sheets. There was a heaviness in my chest I hadn't felt before, an almost physical resistance to moving, to confronting the day. And yet, beneath that heaviness, there was a pulse of excitement, an urgent insistence that I step outside, that I walk into the world as her, fully and unflinchingly. I ran my fingers over my face in the mirror, smoothing the lines of makeup, adjusting the wig that had become part of my identity, and felt a tremor of anticipation. This was no longer about curiosity. It was about survival, not of the body, but of the truth that was insisting on being seen. I chose a flowing dress that moved like water around my legs, soft fabric that clung to my waist and flared with each step. Shoes clicked on the floor as I practiced walking, not because I needed practice, but because every movement carried weight now. There was consciousness in my gestures, a narrative in my posture, and even in the act of leaving my apartment, I felt the story of her unfurling like a ribbon behind me. Each breath, each heartbeat, felt amplified, as though the world had become a stage and I both actor and audience, performer and witness, caught in the fragile interplay between visibility and vulnerability. The social world outside was a crucible. Every glance felt amplified, every reaction a judgment I had to parse in real time. Walking down the street, I noticed how differently people behaved around her, around me. Some smiled warmly, some whispered under their breath, some stared a fraction too long, leaving a chill running down my spine. Each encounter forced me to calibrate myself, to navigate 1,000 subtle signals, and yet, amidst the anxiety, there was a thrill, a sense that I was learning to exist in a space I had long been barred from, that I was testing the boundaries of identity and courage at the same time. At a cafe later that morning, I encountered another test. Sitting alone, I was approached by a woman, curious and kind, who struck up conversation. Her questions were simple, yet each one carried weight. Each glance seemed to measure me, to probe for something I wasn't sure I could name. I laughed nervously, words catching in my throat, voice higher, softer than usual, but there was a flicker of connection that surprised me, a fleeting sense that I could be seen and acknowledged without pretense or shame. And yet, when she left, a tide of doubt swept over me. Did she see me? Or did she see only a performance? The ambiguity was both maddening and exhilarating, and I realized that my sense of self had never felt so fragile, so alive, so necessary to protect. The afternoon brought confrontation I hadn't anticipated. A colleague from work, someone I had thought would never notice, passed by on the street. Recognition flared in their eyes, quick and sharp, and my chest tightened. My first instinct was to flee, to fold myself back into invisibility, but something inside me bristled. I squared my shoulders, forced a calm smile, and met their gaze. The moment stretched impossibly long, a silent negotiation of identity, courage, and truth. Their expression softened, a flicker of surprise replaced by cautious acceptance, and I walked on, heart pounding, body trembling, feeling simultaneously triumphant and exposed. Evening came with a strange, quiet intensity. I wandered through the streets, rain now falling lightly, the city reflecting lights like fragmented mirrors beneath my feet. Each step was deliberate, each glance around me a study in perception and self-awareness. I caught reflections in shop windows, fleeting fragments of her face, her posture, her presence, and I realized with a shiver that she was no longer just an experiment. She was a companion, a revelation, a truth that refused to be ignored. I felt a deep, aching tenderness toward her, a part of myself I had long denied, and an urgency to protect and honor her, even in the face of uncertainty. Back in my apartment, I sat at the edge of the bed, hands trembling slightly, mind racing. The week was moving faster than I could comprehend, yet I felt stretched, transformed, and profoundly awakened. Every interaction, every glance, every step had left marks on me, subtle yet indelible, shaping a self I had only just begun to recognize. And as I traced the line of her jaw in the mirror, I understood. This journey was no longer temporary. It was a doorway into a deeper understanding of myself, a revelation that was fragile, beautiful, and utterly necessary. The experiment had become living, breathing truth, and I realized with both fear and wonder that I could not, and would not, return to the person I had been before. Day 6 began in silence, but the quiet felt heavier than any noise I had heard all week. I woke before dawn, lying in the half-dark, staring at the ceiling as if it could answer the questions that had been pressing against my ribs for days. Who was I, really? Not the man who had left the apartment 6 mornings ago, and not exactly the woman reflected in the mirror now, but the sum of both? The line between experiment and reality was blurring, threading itself through my bones, my heartbeat, my skin. I felt an ache that was almost physical, a hunger for understanding, and a trembling excitement at the same time. This was no longer curiosity, it was a reckoning. Dressing that morning was almost ritualistic. I chose a soft, flowing dress, pale peach that caught the sunlight spilling through the window. I let my fingers linger on the fabric, memorizing its texture, its weight, its whisper against my skin. As I applied makeup, every brushstroke became a meditation. Each line drawn, each shadow blended, was a statement, a claim, a confession to the reflections staring back at me. The wig, now so familiar, brushed my shoulders like a tangible sigh of self-recognition. I studied her, not as a mask, not as a fantasy, but as someone I was beginning to inhabit fully, intimately, irreversibly. And when I looked into her eyes in the mirror, I almost wept, not from sadness, but from recognition, the fragile, luminous acknowledgement of a self I had denied for years. I ventured outside with both trepidation and exhilaration. The streets felt sharper, brighter, more vivid than ever, as if my perception itself had been recalibrated. I noticed subtleties I had always ignored, the way the wind shifted against buildings, the rhythm of footsteps on pavement, the expressions of people passing by. And every glance directed at me carried a weight that had nothing to do with vanity. It was scrutiny, curiosity, judgment, empathy, and indifference, all at once. My heart pounded with the tension of being truly visible, fully present, and utterly fragile at the same time. The first confrontation of the day came unexpectedly. A friend I hadn't anticipated encountering turned a corner ahead of me, and their eyes locked on mine. Recognition flared instantly, sharp and electric, and I felt the familiar tightening in my chest. My first impulse was to shrink, to retreat, to fold myself into the safety of shadows. But instead, I lifted my chin, allowed a tentative smile to form, and met their gaze. The silence stretched, a taut string between us, and I felt every heartbeat echoing in the space. Finally, they smiled softly, a flicker of acceptance, or perhaps curiosity, and passed without comment. I walked on trembling, realizing how fragile courage could feel, how exhilarating it was to insist on your own existence even when the world seemed unsure of your right to occupy space. Afternoon brought solitude, and with it, reflection. I wandered to a quiet park, the kind of place where the world seemed to slow, where trees whispered secrets in the wind, where I could exist without constant appraisal. I sat on a bench, letting my hands trace the contours of her reflection in my mind, her presence a tangible weight in my chest. I thought about the week, the joy, the terror, the wonder, the humiliation, the subtle glances, the whispered judgments, the rare moments of warmth and recognition. Each experience had left its mark, and I felt stretched, reshaped, irrevocably altered. For the first time, I began to understand that identity wasn't something fixed. It was a river, flowing and shifting, and I had been given the chance to navigate its currents fully, intentionally, courageously. But with clarity came conflict. The world outside was still uncertain, still full of judgment I could not entirely escape. Every glance, every step, every interaction was a negotiation, a delicate balancing act between visibility and vulnerability. I felt the weight of expectations, the pressure of preconceptions, the relentless questioning of self that accompanies every act of revelation. And yet, amid the anxiety, there was exhilaration, a dizzying sense of freedom, the thrill of stepping into a truth I had long denied, the intoxicating awareness that I was finally claiming space in the world in my own terms. Evening approached, heavy with the scent of rain and the faint glow of streetlights. I walked slowly, letting each step anchor me, letting each breath remind me that she, the version of me I had been discovering, was no longer temporary. She was present, she was real, she was insistent, and she would not be ignored. I passed windows that reflected fragments of her, and in each reflection I saw 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 lives I might inhabit, 1,000 truths I could no longer deny. The fear that had accompanied me all week, the fear of exposure, of judgment, of vulnerability, had not vanished, but it had transformed. It had become fuel, fire beneath my ribs, relentless insistence that I acknowledge her, honor her, and exist fully in her skin. Back in my apartment, I collapsed on the bed, utterly spent, utterly awake. I ran my fingers along her jawline, traced the curve of her neck, studied the reflection in the mirror with both tenderness and awe. This week had begun as an experiment, a fleeting curiosity, a playful challenge. But now it was a revelation. She was not a costume, not a disguise, not a fantasy. She was a part of me, fragile, luminous, defiant, and impossibly real. And as I lay there, listening to the city hum softly outside, I felt the first deep, unshakable sense of acceptance. Not perfection, not certainty, but recognition, intimacy, and a profound truth I could no longer deny. She was me, and I was finally beginning to meet her fully. The final day arrived with a weight I could feel in my chest before my eyes even opened. I lay there in the dim light of morning, tracing the shape of her face in the mirror across the room, feeling the pulse of a week's worth of transformation thrumming through me. She wasn't just a reflection anymore. She was a presence, a companion, a truth I had carried with me in secret for years. The thought of stepping out one last time as her filled me with both dread and exhilaration. The world outside hadn't changed, but I had. I could feel it in my bones, in the subtle sway of my hips, in the softened cadence of my voice, in the way my chest rose and fell with an intimacy I had never allowed myself before. I dressed slowly, deliberately, as if each motion could etch permanence into this ephemeral journey. I chose a dress that shimmered softly under the morning light, the fabric whispering across my skin. My wig fell naturally around my shoulders, a cascade of dark curls that framed my face perfectly. I applied makeup with a care I hadn't known I possessed, blending shadows and highlights with tenderness, with reverence. And when I finally looked into the mirror, I didn't just see her. I saw myself. Every fear, every thrill, every moment of hesitation, every heartbeat of courage, it was all etched there. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to explain her, justify her, or hide her. She simply was, and I simply was, and the two were inseparable. Stepping outside, the city felt transformed. The streets were alive with possibilities I had ignored for so long. I felt every glance, every whisper, every small, fleeting judgment, but none of it could touch the core of who I was. There was a buoyancy in my chest, a rhythm in my steps that spoke of discovery, of resilience, of recognition. Passing strangers offered smiles, nods, polite greetings, and in those small gestures, I saw acceptance mirrored back, not from them, but from myself. I had spent years asking the world to see me, to validate me, and now I realized the only acceptance that truly mattered had been within me all along. At a cafe I had discovered earlier in the week, I sat at a small table near the window, watching the sunlight play across the floor. The reflection in the glass caught my eye, and I studied it like a scholar examining a lost manuscript. She was radiant, alive, unflinching, a testament to courage and vulnerability intertwined. I let my fingers brush the edge of the table, feeling the ordinary solidity of the world around me, and yet sensing that my perception of it had shifted irrevocably. Everything, the ordinary, the mundane, the fleeting, was infused with meaning, heightened by the awareness of who I was becoming. A friend I hadn't expected to see arrived at the cafe, and for a moment, panic surged in my chest. But instead of shrinking, I smiled, truly and fully, and we spoke. The conversation was gentle, curious, accepting in ways that felt surreal, yet entirely earned. I realized in that moment that the courage I had cultivated over the past week, through glances, stares, stumbles, triumphs, was not performative. It was real. It was mine. And in the quiet intimacy of connection, I felt the full depth of what I had discovered. That existence itself, fully owned and unapologetic, was an act of beauty, of bravery, of liberation. As evening descended, painting the city in amber and shadow, I walked slowly, letting the cool wind wash over me. Every step felt deliberate, every heartbeat a drumbeat of identity, of survival, of revelation. I passed windows and mirrors and glimpsed fragments of her, of me, and smiled softly, a tender acknowledgement of everything I had learned. Fear had not vanished entirely, but it had transformed. It was no longer a cage. It was a companion, a reminder of the fragility and preciousness of this journey, a signal of how far I had come. Returning to my apartment for the last time in this week-long experiment, I stood before the mirror one final time. I traced the line of her jaw, the curve of her lips, the soft fall of her hair, and breathed deeply.
She was not a mask.
She was not a fantasy. She was me, entwined, inseparable, beautiful in her complexity, fierce in her vulnerability, luminous in her defiance. And in that moment, I understood that the week had never been about stepping into another life. It had been about stepping into myself, fully, unflinchingly, unapologetically. I sat on the edge of the bed, exhausted and exhilarated, and let the realization settle into my bones. She would remain, not as a fleeting experiment, but as a constant, vibrant part of who I was. The reflection in the mirror smiled back with warmth and recognition. And for the first time in my life, I felt complete, not perfect, not fully understood, but wholly present, wholly alive, wholly me. The week had ended, but the journey, I realized, was only beginning. And as the city hummed quietly beyond my window, I whispered to myself, softly and clearly, I see you. I see me, and I am here.